Shadowbane Covenant, Elven assassin versus corrupted Druids in dark fantasy. The trees were bleeding again. Lyralei Nightwhisper crouched behind a mass of writhing roots, watching black sap ooze from bark that had once been silver-white. The corruption here ran deeper than usual, deep enough to make even the stones weep shadow. She tracked worse quarry through fouler places, but something about this grove made her skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with professional caution. The flowers screamed when she brushed past them. Not metaphorically. Actual throat-tearing shrieks that sent birds exploding from branches overhead in panic-driven clouds. One blossom, formerly a moonbell, now something with too many petals and what looked suspiciously like teeth, latched onto her leather boot. She drew a throwing knife and severed its stem with clinical precision. The thing died with a sound like a child's sob. Thuron always was dramatic, she thought, stepping over the twitching corpse. Even his corruptions have personality disorders. The trail was easy enough to follow. Corrupted Druids, in her experience, possessed all the subtlety of a forest fire. Where Thuron Oakenheart walked, plants withered into new and creative forms of wrong. A rabbit bounded past with 7 eyes arranged in a crown around its skull. Somewhere in the canopy above, something that might once have been a squirrel chittered in harmonics that made her teeth ache. Lyralei had been hunting corrupted mages for 37 years. She'd learned to read corruption like others read books. Each twisted branch told a story. Each mutation whispered secrets about its creator's mind. Thuron's signature was all over this grove. The desperate hunger for power, the complete abandonment of natural law, the artist's vanity that demanded his victims be transformed rather than simply killed. She paused beside a brook that ran with water the color of old blood and tested the air. Poison-coated throwing knives slid into her palms like old friends returning home. 6 inches of steel, edges sharp enough to split moonbeams, tips blessed with enough concentrated nightshade to drop a corrupted dire wolf in 3 heartbeats. The corruption here was fresh, hours not days. A sound made her freeze, not the usual screaming of mutilated flora, but something else. Something that had once been music. She followed it deeper into the grove, shadow magic wrapping around her like a second skin. To mortal eyes, she would appear as little more than a trick of light, a distortion in the air that might be wind or imagination. The dryad had been beautiful once. Now it writhed in a clearing like a living nightmare, barkskin split open to reveal pulsing red interior, arms stretched into branch-thin appendages ending in clusters of thorns. Where its face should have been, a gaping maw lined with rose petals that bled when they moved. The music came from hollow spaces in its chest, wind passing through wounds that would never heal. It sensed her approach and turned, maw stretching wider in what might have been greeting or threat. Black sap dripped from its ruined mouth. "Sister," it spoke in a voice like breaking branches. "Sister Shadow, you taste of the same darkness." Lyralei said nothing. Words were wasted on the corrupted. They spoke in riddles and lies, their thoughts as twisted as their flesh. She studied the thing's stance, catalogued its likely speed and reach. The thorns would be poisonous, corrupted dryads always were, but the transformation had made it top-heavy, unbalanced. 3 throwing knives whispered through the air. The first took it in what remained of its throat. The second pierced the largest cluster of thorns on its right side. The third buried itself in the pulsing red mass where a heart might still beat. Nightshade entered its system like liquid fire, racing through corrupted channels that had once carried tree sap. The dryad staggered, thorns rattling like bone chimes. Its maw opened and closed soundlessly, black sap flowing faster now. For a moment, just a moment, something almost sane flickered in its remaining eye. "Thank you." It collapsed with a sound like a forest falling. Lyralei retrieved her knives, wiping them clean on leaves that immediately curled and blackened at the touch of corrupted blood. The grove seemed to exhale around her, as if even the twisted landscape recognized that justice had been served. An owl landed on a branch above her head, a perfectly normal owl, which in this place made it stand out like a beacon. Its eyes held an intelligence that had nothing to do with animal cunning. "Elder Moonweaver," she said without looking up from cleaning her blades. "Child." The owl's voice held the weight of centuries, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from watching the world die by degrees. "You've seen what Thuron has done here. I've seen better interior decorating." She slotted the last knife back into its sheath. "This is extensive work, weeks, maybe months of sustained corruption. He's not working alone." "No." The owl preened a wing that glowed faintly silver in the corrupted twilight. "3 others have joined him. The Circle of Shadow, they call themselves. They believe they can merge the natural world with the realm of shadows, make death and life one seamless whole." Lyralei felt something cold twist in her stomach. She'd heard whispers of such things in the Covenant's archives, ancient magics that predated the separation of realms. "They're trying to corrupt the world tree." "More than trying." The owl's head turned completely around, a motion that would have been comical if not for the weight of its gaze. "They've already begun. The tree's roots stretch across all forests, child, if they succeed in corrupting its heart. Every forest would become like this one. Every grove a breeding ground for abominations. Every tree a weeping wound in reality itself." "Where?" she asked. "Follow the corruption to its source. You'll know it when you smell it, the stench of perverted life, of growth forced into patterns that should not be." The owl spread its wings. "And child, be careful. Thuron always favored dramatic gestures, but his new allies are more practical. They've learned to weaponize corruption itself." The owl launched itself into the air and dissolved into motes of silver light before it reached the canopy. Lyralei stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the sound of screaming flowers and weeping trees. She could feel the corruption pressing against her skin like oily water, seeking entrance through every pore. Her own shadow magic stirred restlessly in response, recognizing kinship, perhaps, or simply hunger for power. She pushed deeper into the grove. The corruption grew thicker as she moved, air becoming viscous with wrongness. Plants that had never existed in nature writhed in soil that bled when disturbed. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the sound of screaming, not the mindless shrieking of corrupted flora, but something with intelligence behind it. Something that remembered what it had been before Thuron's experiments began. She found the entrance to his lair hidden beneath a canopy of trees whose branches had grown together into a living dome. The bark here was black as midnight, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Shadow magic poured from the opening like smoke, carrying with it the stench of forced transformation. The screams were louder here, more varied, a symphony of agony that spoke of systematic experimentation, of a mind that had abandoned all constraints in pursuit of impossible knowledge. Lyralei drew her knives and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Time to meet an old friend. The laboratory stretched beneath the grove like a cancer, carved from living rock and lined with cages that defied the basic principles of architecture. Lyralei moved through corridors that branched and twisted according to no earthly logic, shadow magic wrapped around her like a cloak of darkness. Here, in Thuron's domain, the very walls breathed with malevolent purpose. The first cage held what had once been a deer. Now it crouched on 6 legs, antlers replaced by writhing tentacles that dripped black ichor onto the stone floor. Its eyes, too many of them, scattered across its hide like scattered stars, tracked her movement with predatory intelligence. When it opened its mouth, rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the sickly light. She catalogued it mentally. Subject 7, probable timeline 3 weeks, still shows signs of original personality structure. Extensive physical mutation, but cognitive functions appear enhanced rather than diminished. Professional detachment was a survival skill in her line of work. Feel too much sympathy for the victims and you'd hesitate at crucial moments. feel too much revulsion at the corruption, and you'd lose the clinical precision necessary for effective killing. But this was different. The deer's eyes held not just intelligence but recognition. It knew what it had been, what it had lost. Bastard, she thought, moving past the cage. Even for a corrupted druid, that's unnecessarily cruel. The laboratory's main chamber opened before her like the inside of a vast organ, walls pulsing with veins of shadow magic that provided the only illumination. Workbenches lined the space, covered with instruments that belonged in no sane world. Glass vessels bubbled with substances that might once have been blood. Anatomical charts showed creatures that had never drawn breath under clean skies. And in the center of it all, bent over a table where something writhed in restraints, stood Malachar Thornbane. Lyralei knew him by reputation, a druid who'd specialized in animal transformation before his fall. Now his skin showed bark-like patches, and his fingers had elongated into something resembling claws. He hummed while he worked, a sound like wind through poisoned leaves. On the table beneath his hands, a wolf, or what had been a wolf, thrashed against bonds made of living vine. Its fur had fallen out in patches, revealing skin that shifted between flesh and shadow. Where its eyes should have been, empty sockets wept streams of liquid darkness. Fascinating, Malachar murmured, not looking up from his work. The Shadow Realm's influence on mammalian neural pathways is far more extensive than we initially theorized. The subject retains motor functions, but appears to be developing entirely new sensory modalities. The wolf's mouth opened in a soundless howl. Lyralei had seen enough. 3 throwing knives slid into her palm, their weight as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd killed corrupted druids before knew their weaknesses, their patterns. Malachar would be stronger than a normal elf, but the corruption always came with trade-offs. Enhanced power at the cost of reduced reaction speed. She stepped from the shadows. Malachar Thornbane, she said, her voice cutting through the chamber's ambient sounds like a blade through silk. By order of the Shadowbane Covenant, you are judged corrupt beyond redemption. He turned slowly, unhurried, as if he'd been expecting her. His face had elongated into something almost ursine, and when he smiled, his teeth were the ivory white of predator fangs. Lyralei Nightwhisper. He tasted her name like wine. The Covenant's pet killer. Tell me, do you still pretend your shadow magic is somehow pure? Still tell yourself that you're different from us? She threw the first knife without answering. Words were wasted on philosophical discussions with the damned. Malachar moved faster than she'd anticipated, shadow magic erupting from his skin like dark flame. The knife passed through empty air where his head had been, embedding itself in the wall with a sound like breaking bone. He was already transforming, bones extending, muscles bulging as he embraced his bare aspect. But he was talking while he changed, always a mistake. You feel it, don't you? His voice deepened, becoming something between growl and speech. The corruption calling to corruption, the shadow recognizing its own. How long before you stop pretending to be the hero of this story? The second knife took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He roared, a sound that made the laboratory's glass vessels crack, and completed his transformation in an explosion of shadow and fury. 7 feet of muscle and claw and absolute hunger for violence. Lyralei was already moving. The bear thing's first swipe would have taken her head off, but she was smaller, faster, and had 30 years of experience fighting things that outweighed her by several hundred pounds. She rolled beneath his guard, came up with a knife in each hand, opened twin lines across his ribs that immediately began to smoke. Poison blades. Always poison blades. Clever girl, Malachar snarled, black blood dripping from his wounds. But you're fighting in my house now, and I have friends. Something wet slithered across the laboratory floor behind her. Lyralei spun, blades ready, and came face to face with nightmare-given form. The writhing, she could think of no better name for it, moved like liquid shadow, but its substance was flesh. Dozens of animals fused into a single mass of reaching limbs and gnashing teeth. She saw a horse's head jutting from what might have been a bear's torso, an eagle's wing sprouting from a cluster of deer legs. All of it moved with purpose, all of it wanted her dead. "My masterwork," Malachar said, his voice thick with pride and madness. 37 subjects merged into a single entity. It feels no pain, knows no fear, and hungers for nothing but the joy of the hunt. The thing lunged at her with impossible speed for something so massive. Lyralei threw herself sideways, feeling claws the size of swords whistle past her face. She came up running, shadow magic surging through her system like liquid fire. This was what the Covenant had trained her for, not the careful stalk and single killing stroke, but the desperate dance of survival against odds that would crush lesser fighters. Her shadow magic responded to her need, wrapping around her like armor, lending her speed that bordered on teleportation. But she could feel it happening as she fought, the corruption responding to her power, recognizing kinship. Each time she drew on shadow magic, the darkness inside her grew a little stronger, a little hungrier. The writhing cornered her against a wall lined with cages, its mass spreading to block any escape route. Multiple heads turned toward her, jaws opening in a chorus of hunger. Behind it, Malachar laughed with the sound of breaking trees. "Feel it, don't you?" he called. "The shadow wants to help. It's offering you power beyond anything the Covenant taught. All you have to do is stop fighting it." Lyralei looked at the monstrosity bearing down on her, at the corrupted druid who'd created it, at the cages full of creatures that had been twisted beyond any hope of salvation. She thought of the deer with too many eyes, of the wolf weeping liquid darkness, of the world tree that even now might be falling to the same corruption. She thought of her family, dead these 40 years, killed by druids who'd thought they could control power that was never meant to be controlled. "You're right," she said quietly. "The shadow wants to help." Shadow magic erupted from her skin like dark fire, more power than she'd ever channeled before. It hurt, felt like her bones were filling with liquid night, but it also felt like coming home. The writhing hesitated, sensing something new in her scent. "But I don't want your help." She moved like darkness given form, blades trailing shadows that cut deeper than steel. The writhing's first head fell to the laboratory floor with a wet thud. The second followed before the thing could fully register the attack. She was inside its guard now, cutting and carving with surgical precision, each strike severing connections between its constituent parts. The creature began to come apart, individual animals falling away from the mass as the shadow magic holding them together failed. Most were already dead, had been dead for weeks. A few landed still breathing, finally free of Malachar's forced unity. "Impossible," Malachar breathed. "You're drawing more power than any human frame could handle. You should be burning from the inside out." Lyralei turned toward him, and he took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes had gone completely black, and shadows wreathed her like living smoke. "Who said I was still human?" But even as she spoke, she could feel the corruption spreading through her system like poison. The shadow magic was stronger than anything she'd channeled before, but it came with a price. She could feel her thoughts beginning to change, her priorities shifting toward the simple pleasure of violence. Time to end this. Malachar tried to transform again, but the poison from her earlier strikes was finally taking hold. His bare aspect flickered and failed, leaving him half-changed and vulnerable. She closed the distance between them in 3 shadow-wreathed steps and opened his throat with a knife that had drunk the blood of 100 corrupted souls. He died with a look of almost religious ecstasy on his malformed features. As if corruption had been a gift he'd been grateful to receive. Lyralei stood among the wreckage of his laboratory, breathing hard, trying to force the shadow magic back into the careful channels the Covenant had taught her. But it didn't want to go. It whispered to her of power unlimited, of hunger satisfied, of a world where she would never again have to bow to the judgment of lesser beings. She found Thuron's research notes scattered across his workbench, diagrams of the world tree, calculations involving shadow magic's interaction with natural ley lines, a timeline that ended in just 3 days. 3 days until the corruption reached the tree's heart. 3 days until every forest became a laboratory for twisted experimentation. And she was infected now, could feel the darkness spreading through her blood like ink in water. The Covenant would kill her for it, standing orders, no exceptions, unless she could find a way to purify herself before the corruption took hold completely. She gathered the research and what supplies might prove useful, then made her way toward the laboratory's exit. Behind her, the surviving animals called out in voices that held no language but spoke of gratitude beyond words. She didn't look back, couldn't afford to. The shadow magic in her system was already whispering suggestions about how useful those creatures might be, how easy it would be to reshape them into something more practical. 3 days to save the world. And maybe 3 hours before she became something that would rather see it burn. The Shadowbane Covenant's fortress crouched in the mountains like a predator waiting to strike, all black stone and narrow windows that watched the world with calculating eyes. Lyralei approached through the pre-dawn darkness, shadow magic contained but not silenced. She could feel it moving beneath her skin like caged lightning. The guards recognized her, of course. 40 years of service bought you certain privileges, like not being immediately executed for walking up to the gate while radiating corruption like a plague beacon. But she could see the tension in their stances, the way their hands drifted toward weapons when they thought she wasn't looking. Shadowmaster Vale will see you immediately, the gate captain informed her, voice carefully neutral. Behind him, 2 more guards flanked the entrance with the kind of alertness that suggested they'd been given very specific orders about what to do if she tried to flee. The fortress interior hadn't changed in decades, corridors lined with weapons that had tasted corrupted blood, trophy rooms displaying the preserved remains of beings that had once been human, training halls where the next generation of shadow-touched killers learned to walk the line between power and damnation. She'd walked these halls as a child, newly orphaned, burning with rage at the Druids who'd murdered her family. The Covenant had given her purpose, trained her, shaped her into an instrument of surgical precision. Now she returned to them carrying the very corruption she'd spent her life fighting. Irony, she thought, following her escort toward the Shadowmaster's chamber, the universe's favorite seasoning. Shadowmaster Vale waited in a room carved from a single massive geode, walls lined with crystals that sang in harmonics beyond human hearing. He sat behind a desk made from the heartwood of a tree that had died before the first human learned to make fire, ancient beyond measure, and still radiating the cold authority that had held the Covenant together for 3 millennia. Lyralei, his voice carried the weight of centuries, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from making hard choices for longer than most civilizations survived. You're infected. Not a question. The Shadowmaster could read corruption like others read facial expressions, a necessary skill when your life's work involved training people to use shadow magic without losing their souls to it. Yes, no point in lying. Approximately 18 hours ago, the corruption is spreading, but I retain full cognitive function. For now, he gestured to a chair that hadn't been there moments before. Shadow magic, shaped with the casual expertise of someone who'd been manipulating darkness since before she was born. Tell me what you found. She did, spoke in crisp, professional tones about Thuron's laboratory, about the Circle of Shadows' plan to corrupt the world tree, about the timeline that ended in roughly 60 hours. She laid Thuron's research notes on the desk between them, diagrams and calculations that spoke of ambition vast enough to reshape reality itself. 3 days, Vale mused, studying the documents with eyes like chips of midnight. Barely enough time, even if we moved immediately. He looked up at her, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. But we can't send our best operative if she's compromised. The corruption will spread, and when it does, I become another test subject for your students to practice on. She'd seen it before, Covenant agents who'd fallen to corruption, kept alive just long enough to provide training opportunities for the next generation. I understand. Do you? He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Because what I'm offering isn't execution, Lyralei. It's a chance to prove that you can use corruption without being consumed by it. A test. The chamber's side door opened, and Kestra Nightfall entered with the fluid grace that marked her as one of the Covenant's elite. 40 years of partnership, of hunts shared and enemies defeated together. They'd saved each other's lives so many times that neither kept count anymore. Now Kestra's hand rested on her sword hilt, and her eyes held the kind of professional assessment that evaluated threats with mathematical precision. "Hello, Lyra," she said softly. "You look like hell." "Feel worse." Lyralei studied her oldest friend, reading the micro-expressions that spoke of orders received and accepted. "Let me guess, if I fail the test, you're supposed to kill me." "Something like that." Kestra's smile held no humor, though I prefer to think of it as providing you with motivation to succeed. Shadowmaster Vale rose from his chair, shadows gathering around him like living smoke. "The test is simple. We have 3 corrupted agents in the detention levels, former Covenant operatives who fell to the darkness they were meant to fight. If you can destroy them without losing yourself to bloodlust, without letting the corruption guide your actions, then you're still our agent, still trustworthy. And if I can't, then Kestra will ensure you die with honor intact." The detention levels lay beneath the fortress proper, carved from living bedrock and warded with sigils that made her corrupted magic writhe like a living thing. Each cell was a masterwork of containment, not just physical barriers, but metaphysical ones designed to prevent the worst kinds of supernatural escape attempts. The first corrupted agent had once been named Lyralei Nightwhisper. Now he crouched in his cell like a spider made of shadow and malice, his features elongated beyond any hope of recognition. When he saw her approaching, his mouth stretched into a grin that revealed far too many teeth. "Sister," he hissed, voice like breaking glass, "I can smell the darkness in you, the beautiful, hungry darkness that wants to feast on pain." Lyralei felt the corruption in her blood respond to his call, felt the urge to release the restraint she'd maintained for 40 years, and let the shadow magic run wild, to tear the cell door from its hinges and join him in whatever ecstasy of violence he'd discovered. Instead, she drew a single throwing knife and sent it through the observation slot with surgical precision. It took him between the eyes, and he died with that terrible grin still on his face. "Disappointing," whispered a voice in her mind that sounded almost like her own. "He could have shown you such interesting things." "Professional standards," she said aloud, though whether she was addressing the voice or providing commentary for her observers, she couldn't say. The second cell held what had been Myra Shadowdancer, now transformed into something that might charitably be called humanoid. Her skin had become translucent, revealing the network of corrupted magic that served as her circulatory system. She moved like liquid darkness, pressing herself against the cell's walls in patterns that hurt to observe directly. "Don't you feel it?" Myra whispered, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "The freedom, the magnificent terror of having no limits, no conscience, no petty morality to constrain your power." The corruption in Lyralei's system pulsed in rhythm with Myra's words, offering visions of what she could become if she simply stopped fighting. Power beyond imagination, freedom from the tedious restrictions of heroism. She killed Myra with 2 knives thrown in precise sequence, the first to disrupt her form, the second to pierce the core of corrupted magic that served as her heart. Myra's final sound was something between laughter and screaming. Wasteful, the voice in her mind observed. She could have taught you to flow between dimensions. The third cell held Corvin Nightbringer, and he was by far the most dangerous of the three. Unlike the others, he'd retained his human appearance, still looked like the man who'd once been her mentor in the arts of stealth killing. Only his eyes betrayed what he'd become, pupils dilated into wells of absolute darkness that seemed to draw light into themselves. "Lyralei," he said, and his voice carried all the warmth and authority she remembered from her early training. "Look at what they've made you into, a killer ashamed of killing, a predator who apologizes for her nature." She hesitated, just for a moment, but in their line of work, moments were eternities. "The corruption doesn't have to be your enemy," Corvin continued, pressing his advantage with the skill that had made him one of the Covenant's finest. "It can be your ally, your truest self, finally allowed to hunt without restraint." The shadow magic in her system surged, responding to his call like iron to lodestone. For an instant, one terrible instant, she wanted to listen, wanted to open his cell and learn what he could teach her about embracing the darkness. Instead, she threw 6 knives in rapid sequence, each one precisely placed to sever a vital connection in his nervous system. He died quickly, efficiently, without time to speak again. But she could feel the corruption spreading as she worked, could feel her thoughts becoming clearer and simpler. The complex moral calculations that had guided her life were being replaced by something far more elegant, the recognition that strength was its own justification. Finally the voice purred, beginning to understand. "Test completed," she reported, turning away from the cells. Behind her, Kestra and 2 other guards were maintaining careful distance, hands on weapons. "So I see." Shadowmaster Vale materialized from shadows that hadn't been there moments before. "But the corruption is advancing faster than anticipated. You have perhaps 12 hours before the transformation becomes irreversible." "Then we move now." "We?" Kestra stepped forward, and Lyralei could read the conflict in her stance, duty warring with friendship, orders battling loyalty. "I have instructions to monitor you closely, to ensure you don't become a threat to innocence." "To kill me if I lose control," Lyralei corrected. "Let's be honest about what we're discussing." "If necessary," Kestra's hand tightened on her sword hilt, "but I'd rather it didn't come to that." Shadowmaster Vale moved between them with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to diffusing conflicts between lethal individuals. "The World Tree's corruption has accelerated. Our scouts report that Thuron has moved to the final phase. He's already begun the ritual. You have perhaps 6 hours before the tree's heart is completely compromised. 6 hours to cross 50 miles of corrupted forest. 6 hours to penetrate Thuron's defenses and stop a ritual that would merge the natural world with the realm of shadows permanently. 6 hours before her own corruption advanced beyond any hope of reversal. More than enough time, the voice in her mind whispered, if you stop pretending to be weak." They gathered supplies in the fortress armory, weapons blessed against corruption, potions that might slow the shadow magic's advance, equipment designed for operating in environments where reality itself had become unreliable. Kestra worked beside her with the easy efficiency of 4 decades of partnership, but Lyralei could feel the tension radiating from her oldest friend. "You know," Kestra said as they prepared to leave, "if you do turn, I won't hesitate." "I'd be disappointed if you did." Lyralei secured the last of her throwing knives in their sheaths, "But Kestra, if it comes to that, make it quick." They left the fortress as the sun set behind clouds that moved in patterns that defied meteorology, heading toward a forest where the very air had become toxic with wrongness. Behind them, Shadowmaster Vale watched from the highest tower, his ancient eyes reflecting a sadness that spoke of too many promising agents lost to the darkness they'd been trained to fight. The corruption was spreading, the world tree was dying, and Lyralei Nightwhisper was becoming something that might save the world or damn it. Time would tell which. The world tree rose before them like a pillar holding up the sky itself, its vast trunk scarred with veins of corruption that pulsed with sickly light. Where once its bark had gleamed silver-white, now half its surface ran black as midnight, shadow magic eating away at millennia of growth like acid through flesh. Lyralei crouched at the forest's edge, watching the ritual sight through eyes that no longer saw quite the same spectrum as purely human vision. The corruption in her system had advanced during their 6-hour approach, granting her perceptions that would have horrified her yesterday and merely felt natural now. She could see the magic flows converging on the tree's heart chamber, could taste the wrongness in the air like copper on her tongue. Around the tree's base, corrupted creatures moved in patterns that spoke of purpose beyond simple guard duty. They were part of the ritual itself, their twisted life force being drawn into Thuron's working. 63 hostiles, Kestra murmured beside her, voice pitched for her ears alone. At least 12 shadow-touch bears, maybe 20 corrupted wolves, and something large moving in the upper canopy that I don't want to think about too hard. And Thuron himself. Lyralei could feel his presence like a wound in reality, power sufficient to rewrite the fundamental laws of nature. He's completed the initial transformation. Whatever he is now, it's not Elven anymore. Kestra glanced at her with eyes that held professional concern. Your pupils are completely black now. How much time do you think we have? An honest question deserved an honest answer. Maybe an hour before I stop caring about collateral damage. 2 hours before I start enjoying the killing more than the mission. And the corruption's progression. Accelerating. Lyralei could feel her thoughts becoming clearer and simpler with each passing minute. Complex moral calculations were being replaced by elegant truths. The strong consumed the weak, power justified itself, mercy was just another form of weakness. But not uncontrolled. I can direct it, use it. That's what they all say. Kestra's hand drifted toward her sword, right before they lose themselves completely. She's right to be afraid, whispered the voice in Lyralei's mind, now strong enough to feel like her own thoughts. You're becoming something magnificent, something she could never understand. They moved through the corrupted forest like shadows given form, avoiding the patrol routes that Lyralei's enhanced senses could map with supernatural precision. The corruption had gifts as well as cost, speed beyond mortal limitations, strength that could crush steel, perception that penetrated illusion and deception. She found herself wondering why she'd resisted these changes for so long. The tree's heart chamber lay at the center of a root system that stretched for miles beneath the earth. A cathedral-sized space where the natural world's most sacred rituals had been performed for longer than recorded history. Now shadow magic writhed through the air like living smoke, and the walls wept streams of liquid darkness. Thuron Oakenheart stood at the chamber's center, arms raised in supplication to powers that should never have been awakened. But the thing that wore his name bore little resemblance to the druid Lyralei had once known. Shadow magic had remade him from the inside-out skin, become translucent membrane revealing flows of darkness beneath, limbs stretched into inhuman proportions, face elongated into something that belonged on no sane world. Around him, the ritual reached its crescendo. Corrupted creatures lay in precisely arranged patterns, their life force being drawn into conduits of shadow that fed directly into the world tree's heartwood. Above them all, the tree itself pulsed with sickly light, its golden radiance flickering between natural illumination and something far darker. The convergence approaches, Thuron spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's stone walls crack. Soon, the barrier between realms will collapse entirely. Death and life will become one seamless whole, and the natural world will embrace its true potential. Lyralei dropped from the chamber's roof like a falling star, shadow magic wrapped around her like armor of living darkness. 6 throwing knives flew in perfect formation, each one aimed at a critical junction in Thuron's ritual configuration. He deflected them without looking, shadow magic forming barriers of crystallized darkness that shattered her blades like glass. When he turned toward her, his eyes held depths that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Lyralei Nightwhisper," he said, and somehow her name sounded different when shaped by his transformed throat. "The Covenant's greatest killer, come to stop the inevitable. But you're too late, the ritual is complete. The World Tree's corruption cannot be reversed. Watch me." She moved like liquid darkness, speed enhanced beyond any merely human possibility. But Thuron was faster, had abandoned the limitations of physical form entirely. He flowed around her attacks like smoke, striking back with tendrils of shadow that hit like sledgehammers wrapped in ice. The first blow sent her skidding across the chamber floor, ribs cracking under the impact. The second would have taken her head off if Kestra hadn't arrived to parry with a blade wreathed in silver fire. "Nice of you to join the party," Lyralei gasped, rolling to her feet and spitting blood. "Wouldn't miss it." Kestra's sword work was poetry written in violence, each strike precisely placed to disrupt Thuron's magical flows. "Though I have to say, this is even worse than our usual assignments." They fought with the coordination of 4 decades of partnership, moving in patterns that left no openings for counterattack. But Thuron had power to spare, shadow magic poured from him like water from a broken dam, reshaping the chamber's geometry to suit his needs. The floor beneath Kestra's feet suddenly became liquid shadow. She sank to her waist before her blessed blade could carve her free, precious seconds lost to defensive maneuvering. Thuron pressed his advantage, tendrils of darkness wrapping around her throat like a garrote. "Kestra?" Lyralei threw herself at Thuron with reckless abandon, channeling every drop of corrupted power in her system. Shadow magic erupted from her skin like dark flame, meeting his power with force that shattered stone and twisted space itself. For a moment, just a moment, they were evenly matched, power flowing between them like competing tides, each seeking dominance over the other. But Thuron had embraced corruption completely, while she still fought against it. He began to overpower her by degrees. "Stop fighting," the voice in her mind commanded. "Let me help. Let me show you what you could become." And for the first time since her infection began, Lyralei listened. The change was instantaneous. Shadow magic flooded her system like liquid fire, rewriting her at the cellular level. Her speed doubled, then tripled. Her strength became sufficient to crush stone with her bare hands. Her perception expanded to encompass spectrums of reality that mortal minds weren't designed to process. She became something between shadow and flesh, darkness given purpose and will. Thuron's eyes widened in what might have been surprise or recognition. "Magnificent," he breathed. "You're beginning to understand, beginning to see what we could accomplish together." "I see," Lyralei agreed, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "I see everything." She flowed around his defenses like water around stone, striking at pressure points that existed only in the realm of shadow magic. Each blow disrupted his connection to the corrupted power sources that sustained him. Each cut severed another thread in the web of darkness he'd woven around himself. But even as she fought, she could feel the corruption spreading through her thoughts like ink through water. The voice in her mind was no longer separate. It was becoming her voice, her thoughts, her desires. "Yes," it whispered, "this is what you were always meant to be." "Lyra," Kestra's voice cut through the haze of growing bloodlust. "The tree, you have to stop the ritual." Lyralei looked up to see the World Tree's heartwood pulsing with malevolent light, its golden radiance now completely overwhelmed by creeping shadow. The corruption had spread to nearly 3/4 of its mass in minutes. It would be irreversible. But to purify the tree, she would need to channel the corruption through herself, use her body as a filter to separate shadow magic from natural energy. The process would either cleanse them both or destroy them completely. And the corrupted part of her mind found the prospect of mutual destruction appealing. Why save a world that has given you nothing but pain? The voice asked reasonably. Why protect people who would kill you for what you've become? She looked at Kestra, still fighting desperately against odds that would overwhelm any normal warrior. Looked at Thuron, consumed by power that had promised him everything and delivered only madness. Looked at the world tree, dying by degrees under the weight of corruption it had never been meant to bear. For a moment she hesitated. The corruption offered such clarity, such elegant simplicity. No more complex moral calculations, no more doubt or regret or the terrible weight of responsibility. Just power, just hunger, just the perfect crystalline purity of violence unlimited. Lyra, Kestra's voice held something between hope and fear. I know you're still in there. Still in there. Still fighting against the darkness that promised to make everything so much easier. Sentiment, the voice observed with contempt. Weakness wearing the mask of virtue. Maybe, but it was her weakness, her choice to make. Kestra, she called, her voice steady despite the war raging in her mind. When I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back, don't argue, just go. Like hell. That's an order. Lyralei drew the last of her throwing knives, edges gleaming with more than reflected light. From your superior officer to her subordinate. She didn't wait for Kestra's response. Couldn't afford to. The corruption was advancing moment by moment, and soon choice itself would be taken from her. Lyralei threw herself at the world tree's heartwood with every ounce of speed and strength she possessed. Thuron tried to intercept her, shadow magic lashing out like a living whip, but she was already past him. Her hands closed on the tree's bark, and she felt the connection snap into place like a key turning in a lock. The corruption rushed through her system like a flood tide, every drop of shadow magic the tree had absorbed over the past weeks flowing through her body in a torrent of malevolent power. For an instant, she was the conduit between realms shadow and light, corruption and purity, destruction and growth. The voice in her mind screamed in something that might have been rage or ecstasy. You could have been a goddess. I'd rather be human, she whispered, and began the most difficult task of her life, separating corruption from power, shadow from light, poison from medicine. The process was agony beyond description. Every cell in her body felt like it was being rewritten and rewritten again, torn apart and rebuilt according to patterns that shifted moment by moment. She could feel her sanity fracturing under the strain, could feel the corruption fighting back with intelligence and malice. But she held on because Kestra was still fighting behind her, still choosing friendship over duty. Held on because somewhere in the world above, people were going about their lives in blissful ignorance of how close they'd come to losing everything. Held on because 40 years ago, a little girl had sworn to hunt corruption wherever it hid, and some oaths were too important to break. The world tree's heartwood pulsed once, twice, and then its golden radiance blazed forth with power that sent shadows fleeing to the chamber's corners. The corruption was purged in a wave of cleansing light that left the air itself feeling somehow cleaner. Thuron's scream of rage and loss echoed through dimensions as his power source was severed. Without the tree's corrupted magic to sustain him, his transformed body began to collapse in on itself. He reached toward Lyralei with arms that dissolved even as they stretched, his face contorting into expressions of fury and desperate hunger. You don't understand, he whispered as his form unraveled. The separation between realms was meant to be temporary. We could have been everything. He dissolved into motes of shadow that faded like morning mist. Lyralei slumped against the world tree's restored bark, feeling the last of the corruption drain from her system like poison from a wound. She was herself again, tired, battered, but recognizably human. The voice in her mind had fallen silent, leaving behind only her own thoughts and the familiar weight of choices made and consequences accepted. Is it over? Kestra approached cautiously, sword still drawn but no longer pointed in her direction. The trees purified, the rituals broken. Lyralei tried to stand, failed, settled for leaning more heavily against the bark. But I'm changed. Permanently. The shadow magic didn't leave me entirely, I can still feel it waiting. Will you be able to control it? I think so, hope so. She managed a smile that held no humor. Ask me again in a year. Kestra sheathed her sword and offered her hand. Come on, let's go home. But as they walked away from the restored world tree, Lyralei couldn't shake the feeling that home was a place she'd left behind somewhere in the corrupted grove. She was something new now, not quite human, not quite shadow, balanced on the knife's edge between power and control. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when this hunt began. But then, the best endings rarely were. They emerged from the chamber into a forest that was already beginning to heal, corruption fading like a bad dream in the light of the restored world tree. In the distance, she could see normal animals returning to groves that had known only nightmare for weeks. So what now? Kestra asked as they walked. Lyralei considered the question, feeling the shadow magic stir restlessly in her blood. Not gone, never truly gone, but controlled, channeled, weaponized for purposes she chose rather than purposes chosen for her. Now we go hunting, she said finally. There are other corrupted druids out there, other shadow cults that think they can control powers beyond their understanding. And if the Covenant doesn't trust you anymore, if they consider you too dangerous to operate freely, then we operate anyway, Lyralei smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. Some hunts are too important to abandon just because the leadership gets nervous. They walked through the healing forest as dawn broke above the mountains, two hunters who'd found purpose in the space between light and shadow. Behind them, the world tree stretched toward the sky with renewed strength, its golden radiance a beacon of hope in a world that would always need defenders. The corruption would return, it always did, but when it came, they'd be waiting. After all, monsters hunting monsters was just another kind of balance. And balance, Lyralei reflected as shadow magic whispered contentedly in her blood, was all any world could really ask for.